The magnolia plantation stood silent under the silver moonlight of a humid Mississippi summer night in 1853. From the outside, its white columns and sprawling architecture projected the wealth and dignity that defined Southern aristocracy. But behind those pristine walls, darkness festered like the rot beneath perfect fruit. My name is Solomon Wright. I was born in chains on this plantation, but I now record this account as a free man, compelled to document the horrors I witnessed, not supernatural terrors, but the genuine human cruelty that surpassed any ghost story told around slave quarters. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood became the sole mistress of Magnolia Plantation after her husband Jonathan Blackwood succumbed to typhoid fever 3 years prior. The widow, once known for her delicate features and quiet demeanor, transformed after her husband's death. The servants whispered about her changed eyes, how they'd become cold and calculating, as though something essential had been carved from her soul. "Solomon, come here," Mrs. Blackwood called from the veranda one sweltering afternoon. I approached cautiously, my gaze fixed on the worn wooden planks beneath my feet. At 19, I had learned the survival value of appearing invisible. "Yes, mistress." I kept my voice even, controlled. "You'll be attending to Master Richard from now on." She didn't look at me as she spoke, her attention seemingly absorbed by the sprawling cotton fields beyond. "He's returning from his studies next week. You'll serve as his personal attendant." Richard Blackwood, the eldest son at 22, had been away at university in Philadelphia. Rumors suggested he'd developed ideas that contradicted Southern values regarding slavery. Some said he'd even attended abolitionist meetings. "And Solomon," she added, her voice hardening, "you will report to me. Everything he says, everything he does." Her eyes finally met mine, and I felt a cold dread crawl up my spine. "Do you understand?" "Yes, mistress." Little did I know this instruction marked the beginning of a horror that would consume the Magnolia Plantation and everyone trapped within its borders. Richard arrived the following week, accompanied by a quietness that seemed at odds with the boisterous young man who had left 3 years earlier. I observed him carefully as he greeted his mother with a formal embrace. His younger brother Thomas, 18, and raised entirely under their mother's influence, watched from the doorway with undisguised contempt. "Welcome home, dear." Mrs. Blackwood's smile never reached her eyes. "Solomon will show you to your quarters." As I led Richard to his room, I noticed how his gaze lingered on the slave quarters visible from the main house. Once inside, he closed the door behind us and spoke in a hushed tone. "How many new slaves has she purchased since I've been gone?" I hesitated, surprised by the directness of his question. 15, Master Richard, mostly young women." He nodded, his expression grim. "And how are they treated?" "As slaves always are, Master." I chose my words carefully, remembering Mrs. Blackwood's instructions to report everything. "You don't need to hide the truth from me, Solomon." He removed his jacket and loosened his collar. "I've seen enough in Philadelphia to know that what happens here isn't right." I remained silent, uncertain of his intentions. Many slaves had been tricked by seemingly sympathetic whites, only to be severely punished for speaking honestly. Richard seemed to understand my hesitation. "You don't trust me. That's wise." He turned to unpack his trunk, "But I hope to earn that trust." That night I reported this conversation to Mrs. Blackwood as instructed. Her face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened around her teacup until I feared it might shatter. "Continue watching him," she said. "Tell me if he speaks to any of the house slaves or visits the quarters." Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the main house grew increasingly tense. Richard frequently argued with his mother about the treatment of the slaves, particularly the young women recently purchased. These arguments often ended with Mrs. Blackwood retiring to her room with a migraine, and Richard storming off to ride across the plantation. It was during one such ride that Richard discovered something that would change everything. I accompanied him as he ventured to the farthest edge of the property. where an old overseer's cabin stood, abandoned and nearly hidden by overgrown vegetation. As we approached, we heard voices, a woman's pained moans and a man's hushed instructions. Richard dismounted quickly and moved toward the sound. I followed reluctantly, dread building in my chest. Through a dirty window, we witnessed a scene that froze my blood. A young enslaved woman lay on a crude bed, her enormous pregnant belly exposed as an older woman. Martha, the plantation's midwife, examined her. "She's too young," Martha was saying. "Her body ain't ready for this." The pregnant girl couldn't have been more than 14. Tears streaked down her face as another contraction seized her. Richard burst through the door, startling both women. "What's happening here?" he demanded. Martha straightened, her face a mask of practiced subservience. "Just tending to one of the girls, Master Richard." "Why is she hidden out here? Why isn't she in the slave quarters where she can be properly cared for?" Richard knelt beside the girl, whose eyes widened in terror at his approach. "Mistress's orders," Martha replied simply, but her eyes held a warning. The girl screamed as another contraction hit. Richard turned to me. "Solomon, ride back and bring clean water and linens, quickly." I hesitated, torn between his order and what Mrs. Blackwood would do if she discovered this interference. "Now, Solomon," Richard commanded. I rode back to the main house, my mind racing. As I gathered supplies, I was confronted by Thomas, Richard's younger brother, whose cruel smile had become a fixture on the plantation. "What are you doing with those?" He blocked my path, his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Master Richard requested them, Master Thomas." I kept my voice neutral, giving away nothing. "Where is my brother?" Thomas stepped closer, the threat in his stance unmistakable. Before I could answer, Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the hallway. "Yes, Solomon. Where exactly is Richard?" The cold calculation in her eyes told me she already knew. Someone had been watching us. Probably one of the field hands, rewarded for reporting on other slaves. "He's at the old overseer's cabin, mistress," I admitted, seeing no path to protection through lies. "There's a girl there in labor." Mrs. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Not surprise, but resolution. "I see. Thomas, fetch Mr. Wilkes." Mr. Wilkes was the current overseer, known for his unflinching cruelty and absolute loyalty to Mrs. Blackwood. "Solomon, you will return to Richard and tell him I'm sending help. Go now." When I returned to the cabin, the young girl's labor had intensified. Richard had rolled up his sleeves and was helping Martha as best he could, his university education apparently including some medical knowledge. "My mother knows," I said quietly as I entered. Richard's head snapped up. "What did she say?" "She's sending Mr. Wilkes." His face paled. "We need to move her." "It's too late," Martha interjected. "Baby's coming now." As if confirming her words, the girl let out an agonizing scream that seemed to shake the small cabin's walls. Richard returned to helping Martha, his previous concerns apparently forgotten in the immediate crisis of birth. An hour later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin's dirty windows, a tiny wail announced the arrival of a new life. Martha cleaned the infant boy as Richard attended to the exhausted mother. "She needs rest and proper food," Richard said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'll speak to my mother about moving her to—" The door burst open. Mr. Wilkes entered, followed by Thomas and 4 burly field hands. Mrs. Blackwood glided in behind them, her face a perfect mask of aristocratic composure. "Richard, you've overstepped," she said calmly, surveying the scene with cold detachment. "Mother, this girl needed help. She's hardly more than a child herself." Richard stood, placing himself between the newcomers and the young mother. "This girl," Mrs. Blackwood replied, "is plantation property, as is her child. Your interference was unnecessary and inappropriate." Martha had wrapped the infant and now held him protectively against her chest. The young mother watched the scene unfold with exhausted terror in her eyes. "Take the girl and her child back to the slave quarters," Mrs. Blackwood instructed Mr. Wilkes. "Ensure she recovers quickly. We need her back in the fields." "Mother," Richard protested, "she just gave birth." "And who is the father of this child?" Mrs. Blackwood asked suddenly, her gaze shifting between Richard and the young slave girl. The question hung in the air like summer lightning. I saw realization dawn on Richard's face, not guilt, but horror at what his mother was implying. "I've been away at university for 3 years," he said quietly. "You know very well I couldn't be the father." Mrs. Blackwood's smile was terrible to behold. "Do I? You've shown such interest in our property since your return." The trap was closing. I could feel it in the way Thomas smirked, in the calculating gleam in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes. "Solomon." Mrs. Blackwood turned to me. "Who is the father of this child?" Every eye in the room turned to me. The young mother's terrified gaze begged me to remain silent. Martha clutched the newborn tighter. "I don't know, mistress," I answered truthfully. "Interesting." Mrs. Blackwood glanced at the young mother. "Lily, tell us who fathered your child." The girl, Lily, trembled violently, her eyes downcast. "Master Thomas," she whispered so softly I barely caught the words. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at his younger brother with undisguised disgust. Thomas's smirk faltered for only a moment before returning, broader and more defiant. "You see, Richard," Mrs. Blackwood said calmly, "we've been implementing a breeding program during your absence. Quality stock produces quality offspring. It's simple economics." Richard looked as though he might be physically ill. "Economics? You're forcing your own son to increase the value of our investment," she interrupted. "Thomas understands his duty to this plantation." As darkness fell completely outside the cabin window, the true horror of Magnolia Plantation revealed itself. Not ghosts or demons, but the monstrous capacity of human beings to justify unspeakable cruelty in pursuit of profit. "I won't allow this," Richard said, his voice low with suppressed rage. Mrs. Blackwood's smile never wavered. "You have no choice. This is my plantation now. You will learn to embrace our ways, or you will leave with nothing." As Mr. Wilkes and his men moved to take Lily and her newborn, Richard made a decision that would set in motion events none of us could have foreseen. "I'll purchase them," he announced. "Lily and her child. Name your price." Mrs. Blackwood laughed, the sound like breaking glass in the tense cabin. "They're not for sale, especially not to you." She turned to leave, then paused. "Thomas, come. Richard, I expect you at dinner in 1 hour. We have much to discuss about your future role here." As they left, Richard sank onto a crude wooden stool, his head in his hands. Martha continued to hold the infant, humming a soft lullaby as Lily drifted into an exhausted sleep. "They'll separate them," I said quietly. "She'll sell the baby once he's weaned." Richard looked up, his eyes hardened with resolve. "Not if I can help it." He turned to Martha. "Can you get word to the quarters? Tell everyone to be ready." Martha nodded, understanding passing between them without further explanation. "Solomon," Richard said, "I need to know if you're with us." I hesitated, weighing 20 years of survival against an uncertain freedom that might end in death. But the memory of Mrs. Blackwood's cold smile decided me. "I'm with you, Master Richard." As we made our way back to the main house in the gathering darkness, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The true horror wasn't in the shadows or the strange noises that sometimes echoed across the plantation at night. It lived in the grand house with its pillars and prosperity, in the calculated cruelty disguised as business, in the systematic destruction of human dignity for profit. And like all true horrors, it was just beginning to reveal itself. The dinner that evening in the Magnolia Plantation's grand dining room unfolded with the suffocating formality that defined Southern aristocracy. Crystal gleamed under candlelight, silver utensils clinked against fine china, and conversation moved with practiced precision through safe topics: the weather, neighboring plantations, politics carefully framed to avoid direct mention of the brewing national tensions over slavery. I stood in the corner, pitcher in hand, ready to refill water glasses. invisible yet ever present, like all house slaves trained to anticipate needs while remaining unnoticed. From this position, I observed the power struggle disguised as familial dining. Richard had dressed formally as required, his face composed into a neutral mask that betrayed none of the rage I'd witnessed at the cabin. Mrs. Blackwood presided at the head of the table, elegant in dark green silk that emphasized her widow's pallor. Thomas slouched in his chair, occasionally shooting smug glances at his older brother. "Richard," Mrs. Blackwood began after the soup course had been cleared, "now that you've completed your education, it's time to discuss your responsibilities here." Richard nodded politely. "Yes, Mother. The plantation needs proper management. Your father intended for you to take over eventually, but your education in the north concerns me." She sipped her wine delicately. "I wonder if your exposure to certain radical ideas has compromised your understanding of our way of life." "My education has given me perspective, Mother, nothing more." Mrs. Blackwood smiled thinly. "Perspective is dangerous when it blinds one to reality. The reality is that Magnolia depends on a particular order to function." "And what order is that exactly?" Richard's tone remained pleasant, but I detected the underlying steel. "The natural order." She set down her wineglass with precision. "God created hierarchy for a reason. Some are born to lead, others to serve. It is not cruelty, but divine design." Thomas nodded vigorously. "The Bible itself sanctions slavery. Pastor Williams preached on it just last Sunday." "Interesting," Richard replied. "How conveniently Scripture supports economic interests." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mrs. Blackwood's smile vanished. "Be careful, Richard. Blasphemy doesn't become a Blackwood." "Is it blasphemy to question how we treat fellow human beings?" Richard challenged, his composure finally cracking. "What I saw today—" "What you saw today," Mrs. Blackwood interrupted sharply, "was necessary business. Unpleasant perhaps to your northern-influenced sensibilities, but vital to our survival. Forcing your own son to impregnate slaves is necessary business?" Richard's disgust was palpable. Thomas laughed. "Don't act so righteous, brother. You think the other plantations are any different? Every owner with sense is breeding their stock. We're just keeping it in the family, so to speak." Mrs. Blackwood shot Thomas a warning glance before turning back to Richard. "Since your father's passing, I've had to make difficult decisions to keep Magnolia profitable. The price of cotton fluctuates, but the value of strong slaves remains constant. We have the opportunity to establish a reputation for quality that will secure our future." Richard set down his fork carefully. "And how many girls has Thomas fathered children with?" "7 so far," Thomas answered before their mother could speak, pride evident in his voice. "Lily's boy makes 8. "My God!" Richard's face had gone pale. "They're just children themselves." "They're property," Mrs. Blackwood corrected. "And they reach breeding age by 14. We're simply maximizing our investment." "And what happens to these children?" "Your own grandchildren by blood, if not by law." An uncomfortable silence fell. Mrs. Blackwood's expression hardened further. "They are not my grandchildren," she said finally. "They are assets. The females will join our breeding program when they come of age. The males will work our fields or be sold to other plantations." Richard stood abruptly, his napkin falling to the floor. "This is monstrous. Father would never have allowed it." "Your father," Mrs. Blackwood replied coldly, "left this plantation deeply in debt. His sentimentality nearly ruined us. I've done what was necessary to preserve our family's legacy. By turning my brother into a—" Richard stopped himself, but the unspoken accusation hung in the air. Thomas's amusement vanished. He half rose from his chair, face flushed with anger. "Careful, brother. You've been gone a long time. Things have changed." "Clearly." Richard's gaze shifted between his mother and brother as though seeing strangers. "And what role do you envision for me in this enterprise?" Mrs. Blackwood dabbed her lips with her napkin before answering. "You have your father's features. Strong, distinctive. The daughters of several prominent families have already expressed interest in a match. You'll marry well, produce legitimate heirs, and contribute to our breeding program. The horror that crossed Richard's face was unmistakable. You expect me to rape enslaved women, my own half-sisters, perhaps? The silence that followed confirmed his worst suspicion. Not rape, Mrs. Blackwood corrected with chilling calm. Selective breeding, and yes, the strongest female offspring from your father's associations have been reserved for this purpose. Blood strengthens blood. Richard gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. My father had children with slaves. Of course he did. Mrs. Blackwood waved dismissively. All plantation owners do. Your father was at least discreet, but now we're taking a more systematic approach. I won't do it. Richard's voice was low but firm. I'll have no part in this. Mrs. Blackwood regarded him coolly. Then you'll have no part of Magnolia. No inheritance, no allowance, no position in society. You'll be cut off completely. So be it. Think carefully, Richard. Her voice softened, becoming almost maternal. Where would you go? What would you do? You've been educated as a gentleman, not as a laborer, and with your known sympathies no other plantation would welcome you. The North? They may preach abolition, but they don't welcome Southern gentlemen with open arms. Doubt flickered across Richard's face, and I witnessed the terrible power of practical concerns against moral conviction. Even for the privileged, freedom of choice came with consequences few were willing to bear. You have 1 week, Mrs. Blackwood continued. Observe our operation, consider your options rationally, then decide. Richard sat back down slowly. And if I still refuse? Then you'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. Mrs. Blackwood signaled for the next course to be served. Now, shall we discuss pleasanter topics? The Wilkinsons are hosting a ball next weekend. Several eligible young ladies will be present. The conversation shifted, the monstrous revelations set aside as casually as a finished course. I stood frozen in my corner, the water pitcher growing heavy in my hands, my mind reeling from what I'd heard. Later that night, as I helped Richard prepare for bed, he broke the tense silence that had followed us from the dining room. Did you know about this, Solomon? I kept my gaze lowered. Not everything, Master Richard. We knew there was a purpose to the new purchases, and rumors spread about Master Thomas visiting the quarters at night. But the full extent... I shook my head. Mrs. Blackwood keeps her plans close. And my father? His voice cracked slightly. Did he truly father children with slaves? This question placed me in dangerous territory. The truth could destroy the memory Richard cherished, but lies would undermine the trust we needed to escape. Yes, I answered finally, though not like Master Thomas. Your father, he had favorites, women he treated with some measure of kindness. Richard sat heavily on his bed. Kindness, he repeated bitterly. How kind to force himself on women who couldn't refuse. I remained silent, understanding that no response could bridge the gulf between slave and master, between those who experienced such kindness and those who bestowed it. We're leaving, Richard said suddenly. All of us. Every slave on this plantation. Master Richard, don't call me that. He looked up, his expression fierce. Not when we're alone. I'm not your master, Solomon. I never want to be anyone's master. The sentiment was noble but naive. In Mississippi in 1853, relationships between white and black were defined by law and custom, not personal preference. Still, I nodded acknowledgement. It won't be easy, I warned. There are 63 slaves on Magnolia. Some are elderly, some are infants. The overseers are armed. The neighboring plantations would join any pursuit. I have money saved from my allowance, not enough for all, but perhaps enough to bribe the right people. Richard began to pace. We'd need to move north in small groups. Ohio, perhaps, or further to Canada. And those who can't make such a journey, the old, the very young? Richard hesitated. I don't know yet, but I can't leave them to this fate. He turned to face me directly. "Will you help me plan?" I considered carefully before answering. Hope was dangerous for slaves. It could sustain through hardship, but it could also lead to devastating disappointment, or worse, deadly consequences for failed attempts at freedom. "Yes," I said finally, "but we must be careful. Mrs. Blackwood has eyes and ears everywhere. We have 1 week before she demands my answer. We'll use that time to prepare." Over the next few days, Richard's observation of the plantation's operations provided cover for our planning. He toured the fields, the gin house, the slave quarters, always with me in attendance. To any observer, he appeared to be evaluating the business with a critical eye, perhaps reconsidering his initial rejection of his mother's proposal. What no one saw were the whispered conversations with trusted slaves, the careful assessment of which overseers might be bribed, which routes offered the best chance of escape. Through Martha, whose position as midwife gave her freedom to move between house and quarters, messages were passed and plans refined. On the third night, Richard requested permission to dine with Mr. Wilkes, ostensibly to better understand the day-to-day management of field operations. Mrs. Blackwood approved, seeing it as a sign her son was coming around to her perspective. Instead, Richard spent the evening assessing whether the overseer could be turned. "He's devoted to your mother," I warned as we returned to the main house afterward, "and he enjoys his position of power too much." "I noticed," Richard replied grimly, "the way he speaks about the women." He shook his head in disgust. "He'll have to be dealt with when the time comes." To that same night, Thomas paid another visit to the slave quarters. Through Martha, we learned he had gone to see Lily, demanding she be ready to resume her duties as soon as she healed from childbirth. "He's a monster," Richard said when I relayed this information, "shaped by our mother into something inhuman." "He's a product of this place," I replied, "like all of us." Richard gave me a searching look. "Even me?" I didn't answer. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous to voice aloud. Richard had been shaped by Magnolia too, in his reaction against it as surely as Thomas had been shaped by his embrace of its darkest aspects. On the fourth day, disaster struck. One of the young women who had secretly agreed to join our escape attempt was caught attempting to visit her brother in the field quarters. Under questioning from Mr. Wilkes, she broke and revealed fragments of the plan. I learned of this through Joseph, an elderly house servant, who overheard Mrs. Blackwood discussing the matter with Mr. Wilkes in her study. "They know something's happening," I told Richard urgently, when we had a moment alone. "Not everything, but enough to be suspicious." Richard's face tightened with concern. "We need to move faster. Tonight, if possible. That's too soon. We're not ready. We may not have a choice." "If Mother suspects I'm involved—" Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, who sauntered into Richard's room without knocking, a habit he'd developed to assert his new position in the household hierarchy. "Brother," he greeted Richard with a mocking smile, "Mother wants to see you, immediately." The summons filled me with dread. Had Mrs. Blackwood connected Richard to the escape plans? I watched Richard straighten his shoulders, composing his features into careful neutrality before following Thomas downstairs. Left alone, I moved silently through the house toward Mrs. Blackwood's study, positioning myself near enough to hear while appearing to be busy with household tasks. "Richard?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the partially open door. "Mr. Wilkes tells me there's been talk among the slaves. Something about freedom. Is that unusual?" Richard's tone was carefully measured. "Slaves always talk of freedom. This is different, organized. Someone has been encouraging them." Her voice hardened. "Someone educated, someone with resources." A tense silence followed. "You think I'm involved?" Richard said finally. "Are you? If I were planning to undermine your operation, would I tell you?" Mrs. Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "You always were too clever for your own good, like your father." A chair creaked as she shifted position. "I've decided to accelerate our timeline. You'll give me your answer tomorrow, not in 3 days." And if my answer remains no, then you'll leave immediately under escort with nothing. Her tone left no room for negotiation. And I'll deal with whatever plans you've set in motion. How? Richard challenged. Mr. Wilkes has effective methods for extracting information, and I've sent for additional overseers from neighboring plantations. By this time tomorrow, any notion of escape will have been thoroughly discouraged. The cold precision of her threat sent ice through my veins. I'd seen Mr. Wilkes's methods, public whippings that left men and women permanently scarred, both physically and mentally. You can't stop the tide of change, Mother, Richard said quietly. The country is moving toward a reckoning on slavery. Perhaps, she conceded, but that reckoning won't come to Magnolia in my lifetime. Now go. Consider your options carefully. By noon tomorrow you'll be either a full participant in this family's future or a penniless outcast. I slipped away before Richard emerged, my heart pounding with fear and urgency. Our window for action had just narrowed dramatically. Whatever we did, it had to happen tonight. As darkness fell across Magnolia Plantation, tension seemed to rise from the very soil. Extra overseers patrolled between the main house and the slave quarters, their lanterns bobbing like malevolent spirits through the gathering gloom. In the distance, dogs barked, not the normal evening chorus, but the focused sound of hounds being prepared for a hunt. Martha found me as I prepared Richard's evening clothes. "They're getting ready," she whispered. "Wilkes has the whipping post set up in the yard. They're going to make examples once they figure out who's involved." "Tonight," I whispered back, "after midnight. Spread the word to those we trust. Anyone who wants freedom must be ready." She nodded and slipped away, her decades of moving invisibly through the house serving her well. When Richard returned to his room, his face was ashen but determined. I relayed what Martha had told me. "We can't wait," he agreed. "But how? They're watching everything now." I explained the plan that had formed in my mind. Desperate and dangerous, but perhaps our only chance. "The monthly supply wagon arrives at dawn," I said. "It will have extra space on the return journey. 10 or 12 people could hide under canvas." "That only helps a few," Richard objected. "It creates a diversion," I explained. "Once the alarm is raised about missing slaves, search parties will follow the wagon's path north. Meanwhile, the rest of us go east, toward the river. There's a sympathetic ferryman Martha knows." Richard considered the plan. "It might work, but who goes in the wagon? The strongest would have the best chance of escaping if they're discovered." "No," I countered. "The children, Lily and her baby, the young girls Thomas has used. They're the most vulnerable, and the ones your mother would use most cruelly to punish any failed escape." Understanding dawned in Richard's eyes. "You're right, and I'll go with them, at least initially, to ensure they reach safety." "No," I said firmly. "You'll lead the larger group east. You have money, education, and your skin color. The wagon group needs to travel light and silent. They'll have a better chance without a white man, however well-intentioned." He looked ready to argue, but finally nodded. "You're right. I'll be more useful with the main group." He moved to his desk and removed a hidden panel, extracting a small leather pouch. "My savings. Not enough for all, but perhaps enough for bribes and immediate necessities." As the hour grew later, we refined our plan through whispered conversations. Martha brought word that 27 slaves had committed to the escape, fewer than half of Magnolia's enslaved population, but those most desperate for freedom and physically capable of the journey. "The others?" Richard asked. "Too afraid," Martha explained simply, "or too attached to family members, too old or sick to travel." She didn't judge them. Each slave made their calculations of risk and possibility according to their own circumstances. At 11:30, the house finally grew quiet. Mrs. Blackwood had retired to her rooms, and Thomas had gone out riding with friends from neighboring plantations, likely to return drunk in the early hours. The night overseers had settled into their predictable patterns, more alert at the beginning of their shift, but growing complacent as the hours passed without incident. "It's time," I told Richard. "Go to the east field now. The others will begin moving there in small groups. I'll join you after helping with the wagon group." Richard gripped my shoulder, a gesture of equality rarely shown by whites to blacks. "Be careful, Solomon. If this goes wrong, then we'll face what comes," I finished for him. "But better to die seeking freedom than live under what your mother plans." As Richard slipped out into the darkness, I made my way toward the slave quarters where Lily and the other young women waited. The weight of 63 lives, those escaping and those staying behind who would face punishment for our actions, pressed on my conscience. But the memory of Mrs. Blackwood's cold planning, of Thomas's cruel entitlement, strengthened my resolve. The true horror of Magnolia Plantation wasn't in ghostly hauntings or supernatural terrors. It lived in the methodical, rational evil of treating human beings as breeding stock, in the calculation that turned rape into investment and children into assets. Against such monstrous logic, our desperate flight into uncertainty seemed the only sane response. As midnight struck on the plantation clock, we stepped into the darkness, carrying nothing but hope and the determination that whatever came next, it would be faced in pursuit of freedom. The night air hung heavy with humidity as I led Lily and 6 other young women through the shadowed grounds of Magnolia Plantation. Each carried a small bundle, meager possessions and provisions for the journey ahead. Lily clutched her infant son to her chest, his tiny face pressed against her to muffle any sounds. The child, just 5 days old, represented both the horror of the plantation's breeding program and the desperate hope driving our escape. We moved in the space between moonlight and shadow, utilizing paths known only to those who had spent lifetimes navigating the plantation unseen. 3 times we froze as overseers passed nearby, their lanterns cutting yellow swaths through the darkness. Each time we remained undetected, invisible by long practice. The supply wagon waited at the far edge of the northern field, where it had been left in preparation for loading at dawn. Old Josiah, a house slave who had served as the plantation's driver for over 20 years, had agreed to help us despite the terrible risk. His reasons were his own, perhaps atonement for years of complicity, perhaps a final act of rebellion as his strength failed with age. Whatever drove him, his knowledge of the roads and inspection points would be crucial for the wagon group's survival. "Remember," I whispered as we approached the wagon, "absolute silence once hidden. The canvas will be hot, airless. But you must endure until Josiah gives the signal it's safe to emerge." The women nodded, their eyes wide with fear but determined. All had suffered specially under Mrs. Blackwood's breeding program, selected for their youth and health to bear Thomas's children. Now they carried his blood in their wombs, or like Lily, in the infants they delivered. The cruel irony that Blackwood blood might be their salvation, making their children too valuable to kill even if recaptured, was not lost on any of us. Josiah emerged from the shadows, his weathered face grave. "Wagon's ready," he whispered. "False bottom beneath the supply crates. Tight fit, but it'll hide you." One by one, the young women climbed aboard, settling into the hidden compartment Josiah had constructed over several nights of secret work. Lily went last, passing her son to another girl while she maneuvered into the cramped space. 30 miles to the first safe house," Josiah reminded them. "If we're stopped, don't make a sound no matter what happens. Better they kill me than find you." I clasped his shoulder, a gesture of respect between men who might never meet again. "God go with you, and with all of you headed east," he replied. "Now go. The others are waiting." Deal. I slipped back into the darkness, making my way toward the eastern fields where Richard and the larger group would be gathering. The night had deepened, the plantation house now a distant silhouette against the star-filled sky. The dogs had quieted, their handlers believing the threat of escape adequately deterred by the increased patrols. I had covered perhaps half the distance to the rendezvous point when a shout shattered the night's silence. Then another. Lanterns flared to life near the main house, figures moving with urgent purpose. Discovery. My heart pounded as I pressed myself against the trunk of a massive oak, watching the commotion unfold. Had they found the wagon group? Discovered the gathering in the eastern field? Or was it something else entirely? The answer came in the form of a slurred, angry voice, carrying clearly through the night air. "Where is he? Where is my brother?" Thomas had returned from his evening's entertainment and discovered Richard's absence. The nightmare scenario was unfolding, discovery before we'd even begun our journey. I remained frozen, calculating options. The wagon group was still hidden, not yet departed. The eastern field group might still disperse if warned quickly enough, but any movement now, with the plantation rousing to search, carried enormous risk. More lights appeared, moving toward the slave quarters. Mrs. Blackwood's voice now joined the commotion, her commands precise and cold, even in crisis. "Check every building, count every slave. Find Richard." Decision crystallized. I abandoned my direct route to the eastern field, instead circling wide through the cotton fields where the plants, though not yet fully grown in early summer, offered some concealment. My destination, the old signal oak where Martha waited as our communication link between groups. I found her trembling but resolute in the tree's shadow. "They know Richard's gone," I whispered urgently. "They'll search everywhere now." Martha nodded, her ancient eyes reflecting the distant torchlight. "The wagon? Not yet departed. They might still escape notice if the search focuses on Richard." "And the others?" "Warn them to scatter. Return to quarters if possible without being seen. Better to try again another night than be caught in a group." Martha caught my arm as I prepared to leave. "And you, Solomon? They'll know you helped him." The truth of her words settled heavily on my shoulders. As Richard's personal attendant, I would be the first suspected of aiding his disappearance. "I can't go back," I acknowledged. "I'll continue east, try to draw pursuit away from the others." Martha's grip tightened. "Too dangerous alone. I don't have a choice." I gently removed her hand. "Go now. Warn the others." She hesitated, then melted into the darkness with the silent efficiency of one who had navigated plantation life for 7 decades. I moved east, no longer bothering with extreme caution. Speed now mattered more than stealth. Behind me, the plantation blazed with lanterns and torches, the sounds of the search growing as slaves were roused from sleep to be counted, as horses were saddled for riders. I had nearly reached the rendezvous point when a figure emerged from the darkness ahead. I tensed, ready to flee, when Richard's voice came in an urgent whisper. "Solomon, thank God." "They know you're gone," I hissed. "Thomas returned early. The whole plantation is searching." Richard's face, half illuminated by moonlight, showed grim determination. "The others?" "Martha's warning them to scatter. The wagon group is still hidden." He nodded, processing the changed situation. "We need to draw pursuit away from them." My thought exactly. A plan formed between us without need for extensive discussion, the desperate clarity of shared purpose. We would move northeast, away from both the wagon's northern route and the eastern path the larger group had planned to take. 2 men could travel faster than groups with women and children. If we could draw the main pursuit, the others might still escape. We set off at a pace just short of running, using the cover of woods that bordered the eastern edge of the plantation. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew. Men shouting, horses' hooves, and worst of all, the baying of hounds now being led from their kennels. "They're using the dogs," I said grimly. "No amount of care in our path would matter once the hounds caught our scent." Richard said nothing, but his expression darkened. He understood as well as I did what that meant. The hunt was on, in deadly earnest. We pushed deeper into the woods, the uneven ground and tangled undergrowth making progress difficult. Each scratch of branch against skin, each drop of sweat left a trail for the hounds to follow. Our only advantage, knowledge of the terrain that the plantation overseers, accustomed to open fields and well-worn paths, might lack. After perhaps an hour of hard travel, with the sounds of pursuit sometimes fading and sometimes growing alarmingly close, we reached a shallow stream that cut through the forest. "Water!" Richard gasped, both of us breathing heavily from exertion. "It might confuse the dogs." We waded into the knee-deep water, following its flow northward. The cool water offered momentary relief from the night's humid heat, but little real hope of throwing off trained hunting hounds. Still, it might buy precious time. As we sloshed through the stream, Richard spoke in a low voice, conserving breath but seemingly compelled to fill the tense silence. "I keep thinking about what my mother said, about my father." I said nothing, focusing on maintaining my footing on the slippery creek bed. "Did he know," Richard continued, "about the children he fathered? Did he care for them at all?" The question struck me as strangely disconnected from our desperate circumstance, yet I understood its importance to him. The man he'd revered was revealed as participating in the very system Richard had come to despise. "He knew," I answered finally. "He acknowledged them in small ways. Extra food, lighter work, protection from the worst overseers. But he kept them enslaved. His own blood." Yes, there was no softening this truth, though there were rumors he planned to free some upon his death. "Perhaps that's why your mother—" I didn't finish the thought. The implication that Mrs. Blackwood might have hastened her husband's death to prevent such manumissions was too dangerous to voice, even now. Richard seemed to catch my meaning nonetheless. "She would have seen it as theft," he said bitterly, "stealing her property." We continued in silence after that, each lost in private thoughts as we pushed forward through the water. Eventually the stream widened and deepened, becoming unnavigable on foot. "We need to choose," I said. "East toward the river, or north into the hills." The baying of hounds sounded closer now. They'd found our trail to the stream and were working to reacquire our scent. Decision needed to be immediate. "North," Richard decided. "The terrain's more difficult, might slow the horses." We left the stream, careful to step on rocks rather than soft earth that would hold footprints. The woods grew denser as we climbed, the ground rising in increasingly steep slopes. Progress slowed, but so too would our pursuers' pace in such terrain. Dawn was breaking when disaster struck. Richard, exhausted from hours of travel through difficult terrain, caught his foot in a root tangle and fell heavily. The crack of breaking bone seemed unnaturally loud in the forest's morning stillness, followed immediately by his strangled cry of pain. I dropped to his side, quickly assessing the damage. His right ankle lay at an unnatural angle, already swelling visibly. "Go on," he gasped through clenched teeth. "Leave me. I'll only slow you down." "No," the response came automatically. "We continue together." "Don't be a fool, Solomon." Richard's face was grey with pain. "They're close behind if they catch us both." He didn't need to finish. If captured, I faced whipping at minimum. Likely death as an example to others who might consider escape. Richard, as the master's son, would face financial ruin and social ostracism, but not physical punishment. Still, I hesitated. Every instinct for self-preservation urged abandoning him to save myself, yet something deeper held me in place. Not loyalty to a master, but commitment to a fellow human who had risked everything to oppose a monstrous system. The baying of hounds decided me. They were close now, perhaps less than a mile behind. Even carrying Richard, I couldn't outpace them much longer. But perhaps there was another way to ensure some part of our plan succeeded. "The others," I said urgently, "the wagon group, the Eastern Party. If they're captured, what happens to them?" Richard understood my question's purpose immediately. "Severe punishment, sails to separate them, but not death. They're too valuable. And if you're found with me, if it appears I forced you to help us." His eyes widened as he grasped my suggestion. "Mother might believe it, that you kidnapped me, forced me to help as leverage. It would give her a way to save face, preserve the family name. Then that's our story." I began fashioning a crude splint for his ankle using fallen branches and strips torn from my shirt. "I forced you to reveal the escape plan, used you as hostage. When you fell, I abandoned you." "They'll kill you if they catch you," Richard protested. "They'll try," I replied grimly, but at least the others might have a chance. And if I reach the river, I didn't complete the thought. Freedom remained a distant, unlikely prospect, but not an impossible one. Richard gripped my arm. If you make it north, find a man named William Still in Philadelphia. Tell him Richard Blackwood sent you. He'll help. I nodded, committing the name to memory, then helped Richard position himself against a tree where he would be visible to pursuers. Make it convincing, I advised. Your mother will want to believe you were coerced. Give her that opportunity. Solomon. Richard seemed to struggle for words adequate to our parting. I'm sorry. For all of it. Save your apologies for God, I replied, not unkindly, and use your life to make amends. With that, I turned and continued north, alone now and moving faster without Richard's injured weight. Behind me, I heard him begin to shout for help, playing his role in our final deception. Whether it would succeed in protecting the others remained to be seen, but it offered a chance, however slight. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to buckle, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind me. The dogs' baying had changed pitch. They had found Richard, but some handlers continued on my trail. The hunt was splitting, just as we'd hoped. The terrain grew steeper, rockier. I used every trick known to runaway slaves, crossing water when possible, brushing my path with pine branches to mask scent, doubling back to create confusing trails. Still, the pursuit continued, sometimes fading with distance or misdirection, but always resuming. By midday, I had reached the edge of lands I knew. Before me stretched unfamiliar territory, dangerous with unknown hazards, but offering the possibility of freedom if I could maintain my lead long enough. It was then that I heard voices approaching from ahead rather than behind. A new group of pursuers who had circled wide to cut off escape routes. I was being surrounded. I sought cover in a dense thicket, controlling my labored breathing as hoofbeats approached from the north. Through gaps in the foliage, I glimpsed riders, not plantation overseers, but a different threat entirely. Slave catchers, professionals who earned bounties for returned runaways. Mrs. Blackwood had evidently spared no expense in organizing the pursuit. As they passed within yards of my hiding place, I caught fragments of conversation. Found the master's son, broken ankle, claims he was forced by his houseboy. Reward for the boy is 500 alive, 200 dead. So Richard had told our agreed-upon story, and it had been believed, or at least not immediately rejected. But the price on my head confirmed the stakes. $500 was a fortune, more than most slaves were valued at. Mrs. Blackwood wanted me captured alive, presumably for public punishment as a warning to others. I remained hidden until the riders passed, then changed direction, moving west now instead of north. It was a desperate gamble. West led eventually back toward populated areas, plantations, greater risk of discovery. But with pursuers now ahead and behind, established escape routes were closed to me. The day passed in a haze of exhaustion, thirst, and constant vigilance. I moved when safe, hid when necessary, and conserved strength when possible. By nightfall, I had covered perhaps 15 miles of difficult terrain, but the pursuit showed no signs of abandoning the hunt. As darkness provided better cover, I risked approaching a small stream to drink and briefly rest. The water tasted of salvation after nearly 24 hours without, but I allowed myself only enough to ease the worst thirst. Too much would cause sickness and slow me further. It was while crouched by this stream, cupping water to my parched lips, that I detected movement nearby, not the obvious approach of horses or hounds, but the deliberate stealth of someone moving carefully through underbrush. I froze, senses straining in the darkness. The night sounds of insects and frogs had dimmed near the disturbance, another sign of an approach. Friend or foe, human or animal, I couldn't determine, but survival demanded assuming threat. I began to withdraw from the stream bank when a whispered voice reached me. "Solomon Wright?" I made no response, suspecting a trick. Slave catchers were known to use deception, pretending to be sympathetic to lure runaways into revealing themselves. "I'm a friend of Martha's," the whisper came again. From the Williamson place. Martha had mentioned connections on neighboring plantations, part of the invisible network slaves maintained despite Master's efforts to isolate them. Still, caution was essential. "If you're Martha's friend," I whispered back, "you know what she carries." A moment's silence then, a carved wooden cross hidden in her left sleeve, a gift from her mother. The detail was correct. Martha's most treasured possession, shown only to those she trusted completely. I eased back toward the voice, still ready to flee at the first sign of betrayal. A figure gradually became visible in the dim starlight. A black man, perhaps a few years older than my 29 years, dressed in the rough clothing of a field hand. "Isaiah Williamson," he introduced himself in a low voice. "Martha got word to us. Been watching for you since yesterday." "The others?" I asked urgently. "The wagon? The Eastern group?" Isaiah's expression grew grim. "Wagon got through. They found the gathering spot for the others. Some escaped, some were caught. They're being held in the punishment shed at Magnolia." My stomach clenched at the news. The punishment shed was where the worst whippings took place, where examples were made. "And Richard, the master's son, brought back to the house. His story about being forced is holding for now, but—" Isaiah hesitated. "But what?" "The mistress isn't fully convinced. She's having everyone questioned, harshly." Guilt washed over me. Those who remained behind were suffering for our attempted escape, yet turning back was impossible. It would help no one and waste the sacrifice already made. "I need to keep moving," I said. "There are search parties all through these woods." Isaiah nodded. "That's why I came. There's a place you can hide, rest properly. Then we have a route planned." I hesitated, wary of trusting too easily. "You have little choice," Isaiah pointed out. "You're exhausted, unfamiliar with this territory, and surrounded. Alone, you'll be caught within days." The truth of his assessment was undeniable. I had reached the limits of what could be accomplished by individual effort. Either I accepted help from this network Martha had connected me to, or I would fail. "Lead on," I conceded. Isaiah guided me through the darkness with the confidence of one who had traveled these woods many times. We moved steadily west for perhaps 2 hours, then turned south briefly before reaching what appeared to be an abandoned trapper's cabin, so overgrown with vegetation it was nearly invisible until we stood before its door. Inside, a single candle provided minimal light. 2 other men waited, one black, one surprisingly white. The white man, introduced only as Brother Joseph, spoke with the distinctive cadence of a Quaker. "Thee is welcome, friend," he greeted me. "Rest now. We move at first light." Too exhausted to question further, I accepted the offered food, cold cornbread and dried meat, and collapsed onto a pallet in the corner. Despite the ongoing danger, despite worry for those captured, I fell immediately into the deep sleep of absolute exhaustion. I awoke to gentle shaking and grey pre-dawn light filtering through the cabin's single grimy window. Isaiah stood over me, urgency in his expression. "Time to move. Patrols are changing." I rose stiffly, body protesting the previous day's exertion. Brother Joseph handed me a bundle containing rough clothes different from my house slave attire. "Change quickly," he instructed. "And this," he passed me a folded paper, "keep hidden, but have it ready if stopped by anyone who might be sympathetic. It's a letter from a Quaker minister, attesting thou art a free man of colour, travelling north on business." The forged free papers might fool some, but any thorough questioning would reveal the deception. Still, it offered some protection in territories where not every black face was automatically assumed to be an escaped slave. "What's the plan?" I asked as I changed. "South," Isaiah answered. 2 days' travel to the river, a contact there with a boat, then north along the waterways where possible. I frowned. "South takes me closer to Magnolia." "Which is why they won't look for thee in that direction," Brother Joseph explained. The search is concentrated north and east. The logic was sound, if counterintuitive. Sometimes the path to freedom required moving temporarily back toward bondage. We departed as the first birds began their morning songs, moving with purpose but without the desperate flight of the previous day. Brother Joseph and the other man, introduced as Nathan, led the way. Isaiah and I followed, maintaining the fiction that we were free black men in the employ of these whites should we encounter anyone. The day passed with tense but uneventful travel. Twice we hid as riders passed nearby, but they showed no indication of searching specifically for us. By nightfall, we had covered substantial distance without detection. As we made camp in yet another abandoned structure, this time a disused tobacco-curing barn, Isaiah shared news he'd gathered from the underground network. The wagon made it to the first safe house, he reported. Lily and her child, all the young women, they're being moved north in smaller groups now. Relief washed through me. At least that part of our plan had succeeded. And Magnolia? The others? Isaiah's expression darkened. Public whipping yesterday. 10 lashes each for everyone suspected of knowing about the escape, 20 for those who admitted planning to go. I closed my eyes, sick with the knowledge that others suffered for freedom I now pursued. Richard, confined to the house. His mother claims he's recovering from his ordeal, but word is she doesn't let him speak to anyone alone. Our deception had worked, at least partially. Richard was not facing charges of assisting slave escape, a serious crime that could have resulted in imprisonment. But he was effectively a prisoner in his own home, his future uncertain. The search for you continues, Isaiah added. $500 is bringing out every slave catcher and opportunist in 3 counties. But they're looking in the wrong places thanks to the false trails Brother Joseph's friends have been laying. I nodded, grateful for this invisible network of support I'd never known existed during my years at Magnolia. The Underground Railroad, spoken of in whispers among slaves but seemingly mythical in its operations, was real and active, even here in deepest Mississippi. Why? I asked Brother Joseph as he joined our conversation. Why risk everything to help people you don't know? The Quaker's weathered face showed no hesitation. Because no man should own another, because God's light shines in thee as it does in me, and because this country cannot continue half slave and half free. Sooner or later, it must become all one thing or all the other. His words echoed sentiments I'd heard Richard express after returning from university. The growing division in the country between slave and free territories, the increasing tension as the nation expanded westward, the fundamental moral question that could not be forever compromised away. There will be war, I said quietly, voicing the thought many had but few spoke aloud. Brother Joseph nodded gravely. I fear thee is right. The signs are all around us. The violence in Kansas Territory, the Fugitive Slave Act turning the North into hunting grounds, the hardening of positions on both sides. He sighed heavily. But tonight, our concern is getting these safely away. The larger struggles will unfold as they must. We continued south for another full day before turning west toward the river. Each mile increased my sense of disorientation, not just geographic displacement, but the profound untethering of identity that came with flight from all I had known. I was neither slave nor truly free, moving through a liminal space between defined states of being. By the 3rd evening of travel with my guides, we reached the banks of the Yazoo River, where a grizzled riverman named Tobias waited with a shallow draft boat. Brother Joseph and Nathan would go no further. They had other passengers to assist, but Isaiah would continue with me for the next leg of the journey. As we prepared to part ways, Brother Joseph pressed a small Bible into my hands. "For the journey ahead," he said simply, "may it light thy path." I thanked him, unexpectedly moved by the gift. As a house slave, I had learned to read despite laws forbidding it. Richard's father had allowed it, considering it useful for a personal attendant to be literate. But owning a book Any book was a new experience. We boarded the boat as darkness fell completely, using only the stars and Tobias's intimate knowledge of the river to navigate. The current carried us steadily northward, the water's surface black as oil in the night, reflecting stars like scattered diamonds. "How far?" I asked Tobias quietly. "To freedom." He gave a soft, humorless laugh. "Farther than this old boat can take you. But I'll get you to the next stop. After that, it's someone else's task." I understood then that my journey was just beginning. The $500 on my head would follow me north, where the Fugitive Slave Act made even free states dangerous for escaped slaves. True safety might lie only in Canada, hundreds of miles yet to travel. As the boat slipped silently through the dark water, I opened Brother Joseph's Bible, running my fingers over the printed words, visible in the faint starlight. My gaze fell on a passage from Exodus. "And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows, and I am come down to deliver them." The ancient words of another enslaved people seeking freedom resonated across centuries to my present circumstance. Whatever lay ahead, capture and return to a fate worse than before, death on this dangerous journey, or the promised land of freedom, I was no longer property, but a man charting his own course. The true horror of Magnolia Plantation lay behind me, though its effects would never fully fade. The methodical evil of Mrs. Blackwood's breeding program, the corruption of Thomas into a monster of entitlement, the countless lives twisted and broken in service to profit and power. These were the real terrors, far more chilling than any supernatural tale. As our boat rounded a bend in the river, Magnolia Plantation fell beyond the horizon of my past. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of a life defined not by ownership, but by freedom. I closed the Bible and turned my face northward, toward whatever future awaited. 10 years passed before I returned to Mississippi. A decade in which I journeyed from slave to freeman, from fugitive to soldier, from possession to citizen, at least on paper. The river journey begun that night, continued for weeks, a winding path northward through a network of sympathizers both black and white. I traveled by boat, by cart hidden under produce, by foot through forests and fields, always moving, always looking over my shoulder. Philadelphia eventually became my sanctuary, thanks to Richard's connection with William Still, a free black man who served as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Still recorded my story among the thousands he documented, preserving the history of those who escaped bondage. Under his guidance, I found work, shelter, and a community of former slaves and abolitionists. When war finally erupted in 1861, as Brother Joseph had predicted that night in the tobacco barn, I eventually joined the Union Army, the 1st Regiment United States Colored Troops. We fought not just for Union, but for freedom, knowing that our service might finally force America to confront its original sin. Now it was 1863, and President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had transformed the war's purpose. I returned to Mississippi not as a fugitive, but as Sergeant Solomon Wright, part of a unit assigned to identify and liberate plantations as Union forces advanced through the state. The irony was not lost on me as our detachment approached Magnolia Plantation in the humid heat of a July afternoon. 10 years earlier, I had fled this place in darkness and terror. Now I returned in broad daylight, uniform on my back, rifle in hand, authority of federal government behind me. "You sure this is the place, Sergeant?" Lieutenant Collins, our white commanding officer, reined in his horse beside me. A Massachusetts man with abolitionist convictions, Collins treated the black soldiers under his command with unusual respect. "Yes, sir." I surveyed the familiar approach to Magnolia's main house, noting changes time had wrought. The once immaculate grounds showed signs of neglect. Confederate war demands had stripped plantations of labor and resources. "This is Magnolia." "How many slaves when you were here?" 63, sir, but that was a decade ago." Collins nodded thoughtfully. Intelligence suggests the owner is a Mrs. Blackwood. Still in residence? If she's alive, she'll be there, I replied with certainty. Eleanor Blackwood would die before abandoning Magnolia. And her sons? Records mention 2. Thomas would be 28 now. Richard, 32. I kept my tone neutral, though the names evoked starkly different emotions. I have no information on their whereabouts. This wasn't entirely true. Through William Still, I'd occasionally received word of Richard over the years. After our escape attempt, he'd remained under his mother's control for nearly 2 years before finally breaking free, disinherited but determined. He'd made his way north and joined the abolitionist movement, eventually serving as a civilian aide to Union forces. Whether he had returned to Mississippi, I didn't know. Thomas was a different matter. No information had reached me about his fate, though I'd heard rumors of young plantation men forming Confederate cavalry units early in the war. Very well. Advance with caution, Collins ordered the company. Remember, we're here to liberate, not to destroy. No unauthorized property damage, no personal vengeance. This last directive came with a glance in my direction, not accusatory but acknowledging the history I'd shared with him during our campaign. We proceeded down the Oak Line Drive, leading to the main house. No shots greeted us, though I remained tense, half expecting Thomas or an overseer to emerge with weapons. Instead, as we reached the circular drive before the house, the front door opened to reveal Eleanor Blackwood herself. 10 years had transformed the handsome widow into an austere old woman. Her black dress, likely mourning attire, hung on a frame grown gaunt with age or privation. Her hair, once dark with threads of silver, had turned completely white, but her posture remained rigid, unbowed, and her eyes retained the cold calculation I remembered. "Union soldiers on my property," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. I suppose it was inevitable. Lieutenant Collins dismounted, approaching with formal correctness. "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood? I am Lieutenant James Collins, United States Army. By order of General Grant and authority of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, I am here to inform you that all persons held in bondage on this property are hereby free." Mrs. Blackwood's expression didn't change. "Am I to be evicted from my home as well?" "No, ma'am. The property remains yours, though any enslaved persons are free to leave or negotiate terms as paid laborers if they wish to stay." Her gaze moved past Collins, scanning our unit until it fell on me. I saw the moment of recognition, a slight widening of eyes, a tightening of her mouth. "Solomon," she said, my name like ice on her tongue. "You return with conquering heroes. How theatrical." I said nothing, maintaining military bearing despite the turmoil her presence evoked. I had prepared for this moment, yet the reality of facing the woman who had attempted to transform Magnolia into a human breeding farm still struck like a physical blow. "Lieutenant," Mrs. Blackwood returned her attention to Collins, "you may proceed with your liberation. My overseer, Mr. Jenkins, can direct you to the quarters. I assume you'll want to make some grand announcement." "Thank you, ma'am," Collins replied with stiff courtesy. "Sergeant Wright will accompany me. The rest of the unit will secure the perimeter." As we followed the newly appointed overseer, Mr. Wilkes evidently gone, perhaps to war, toward the slave quarters, I took stock of Magnolia's changed appearance. The cotton fields were only partially planted, the gin house closed, outbuildings in need of repair. The war had not been kind to this operation that once represented the height of plantation prosperity. The slave quarters themselves seemed diminished, fewer cabins occupied, those remaining in poor condition. As we approached, faces appeared in doorways and windows, expressions guarded, suspicious. "Call them to assemble," Collins instructed Jenkins. The overseer gave a half-hearted shout. Slowly, reluctantly, people began to emerge from the cabins, perhaps 20 in all, far fewer than the 63 souls who had been enslaved during my time at Magnolia. "Where are the others?" I asked Jenkins. He shrugged. "Run off. Sold to fund the Confederate cause. Died. War changes everything. Changes. As the remaining slaves gathered in the dusty central area between cabins, I scanned faces, searching for anyone I recognized from a decade earlier. Most were unfamiliar, though a few elderly faces triggered distant memories. Then I saw her. Martha, impossibly still alive, her face now deeply creased with age but unmistakable. She stood, supported by a younger woman, her body bent but her eyes alert as they found mine. A slight nod acknowledged our shared past, our improbable reunion. Lieutenant Collins stepped forward to deliver the proclamation of freedom, his words formal but heartfelt. As he spoke, I observed the reactions among the gathered slaves, disbelief predominant, followed by cautious hope, confusion, even fear. Freedom after lifelong bondage was not simply joy. It was disorientation, uncertainty, terror of the unknown, alongside desire for liberation. "You are free to leave this plantation immediately if you choose," Collins concluded. "Or you may negotiate labor terms with Mrs. Blackwood if you wish to remain. The Union Army can provide transport to refugee camps for those who choose to depart, but have no immediate destination." Murmurs broke out among the freed people, questions and concerns emerging in a rush now that the initial shock had passed. Collins gestured for me to step forward. "Sergeant Wright was once enslaved here," he introduced me. "He can answer your questions while I discuss transitional arrangements with Mrs. Blackwood." As Collins departed with the sullen overseer, I found myself surrounded by former slaves hungry for information about what freedom might mean. I answered as honestly as possible, acknowledging both the opportunities and challenges ahead, drawing on my own experience of the difficult transition from slavery to freedom. Throughout this discussion, Martha remained silent, watching. When the group finally dispersed to consider options and gather meager possessions, she approached, her assistant helping her navigate the uneven ground. "Solomon Wright," she said, her voice thinner than I remembered, but still carrying the dignity that had sustained her through decades of bondage. "The Lord let these old eyes see you return as a free man." "Martha!" I took her weathered hands in mine, emotion tightening my throat. "I never thought to find you still here. Where else would I go? Too old to run, too stubborn to die." A smile briefly transformed her face. "But now you bring freedom to my doorstep. God works in mysterious ways indeed." "Will you leave?" I asked. "We can arrange transport, find you placement with a family in the north." She shook her head. "My bones will rest in Mississippi soil, but others should go." She lowered her voice. "Especially the young ones from the breeding program. Those who remain." So Mrs. Blackwood had continued her monstrous enterprise, even as war raged across the South. My jaw tightened with renewed anger. "How many?" I asked. 5 girls, 3 with children." Martha glanced toward a cabin set apart from the others. "The youngest is 14, history repeating its horrors, the same ages as the girls I'd helped escape a decade earlier." "And Thomas?" But I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. "Is he still involved?" "Gone 2 years now, fighting with Forrest's cavalry last we heard." Martha's expression revealed nothing of her feelings about the younger Blackwood son. But there were others, overseers, Confederate officers who passed through. The breeding program had evolved but not ended, adapting to war conditions while maintaining its fundamental evil. Even with slavery collapsing across the South, Mrs. Blackwood had persisted in her methodical exploitation of human beings as reproductive property. "The girls will leave," I promised Martha. "Today, I'll see to it personally." I returned to the main house to find Lieutenant Collins concluding his official business with Mrs. Blackwood. Her composure remained intact, her manner that of an aristocrat tolerating an unpleasant but temporary inconvenience. "Ah, Sergeant," Collins acknowledged my arrival. "Mrs. Blackwood has been informing me about the plantation's current operations." His expression suggested the conversation had been less than forthcoming. "Lieutenant," I said formally. "I need to speak with you regarding urgent transport requirements for some of the freed people." "Of course." He turned back to Mrs. Blackwood. "If you'll excuse us, ma'am." "By all means." Her cold gaze fixed on me. "I'm sure Solomon has many tales to tell." Once outside and beyond earshot, I briefed Collins about Martha's information. His expression darkened as he grasped the implications of what I described. "A breeding operation?" he asked, disgust evident in his voice. "Using enslaved women to produce more slaves?" "Yes, sir. It was established before I escaped 10 years ago. According to Martha, it continued throughout the war, though on a smaller scale." Collins ran a hand over his face, momentarily dropping the military formality that normally defined him. "Just when I think I've seen the worst this institution has to offer." He straightened, resolution hardening his features. "We'll evacuate everyone who wishes to leave immediately, with priority for these young women and their children." "Thank you, sir." "And write," he added, "document everything. Names, ages, conditions. President Lincoln has commissioned a report on slavery's practices for the historical record. This breeding program needs to be included." I nodded grimly. The horrors of Magnolia Plantation would not remain hidden in the Mississippi soil. They would be recorded, remembered, a testament to the depths of cruelty justified in slavery's name. As we organized the evacuation, I sought out the young women Martha had mentioned. They were gathered in the cabin she had indicated, 5 girls ranging from 14 to perhaps 19, 3 with infants or toddlers. Their faces showed the same wary disbelief I had seen in the others, but with an added layer of trauma that was painfully familiar. "I'm Sergeant Solomon Wright," I introduced myself gently. 10 years ago, I helped 7 young women like you escape from this plantation. Today, I've returned to offer you freedom." The oldest of them, a slender girl holding a baby no more than 6 months old, studied me with cautious eyes. "Where would we go?" she asked. "Initially to a Union refugee camp," I explained. "From there, aid societies can help place you with sympathetic families in the North, arrange education, training, employment." "Together," she pressed, "or will they separate us? Sell the children?" The question revealed the deep fear ingrained by their experiences, that freedom might bring new forms of exploitation rather than true liberation. "No one will be separated unless by choice," I assured her. "No one will be sold ever again. You and your children are free human beings now, not property." Slowly, tentatively, hope began to replace suspicion in their expressions. As they gathered their meager possessions, I documented their stories as Collins had instructed. Names, ages, parentage of the children. The pattern was as Martha had described, systematic rape disguised as breeding, with careful records kept of which girls produced the healthiest children. By mid-afternoon, wagons had been arranged for those choosing to leave, 17 of the 20 former slaves, including all the young women from the breeding program. As they loaded their bundles, Martha approached me again, this time without her assistant. "I have something for you," she said, pressing a small object into my hand. "Found it after you escaped, kept it safe all these years." I looked down to find a carved wooden button in my palm, part of a set that had adorned Richard Blackwood's university coat. The sight of it brought memories flooding back. Richard's determination to oppose his mother's cruelty, our desperate flight through the night, the painful parting when his injury forced us to separate. "He left it deliberately," Martha explained, "in the slave quarters the day before you both fled. Said if anything happened to him, it would prove he'd chosen his path willingly." Her eyes held mine. "I think he wanted someone to know he wasn't forced, that he chose to help us of his own free will." The simple wooden disc carried the weight of a moral choice made a decade earlier. A privileged young man rejecting the system that benefited him, risking everything to oppose an evil his family embraced. "Have you heard anything of him?" I asked. "Richard?" Martha shook her head. Nothing certain. Rumors he was in Boston, then working with the Freedmen's Bureau. Mrs. Blackwood never speaks his name. As our conversation concluded, I noticed movement at the main house. Mrs. Blackwood had emerged onto the veranda, watching the exodus of her former property with an expression of cold disdain. Our eyes met across the distance, mutual recognition of the transformed power dynamic between us. Once she had held absolute authority over my existence. Now I represented the force dismantling her world. Rather than retreat from her gaze, I deliberately approached the house, climbing the steps to stand before her. Up close, the decade's toll on her was more evident, the lines etched by bitterness and hardship, the slight tremor in hands that had once signed purchase orders for human beings with unwavering precision. "Have you come to gloat, Solomon?" she asked, her voice still carrying the aristocratic inflection that had once commanded Magnolia's empire. "No, Mrs. Blackwood. I've come to ask a question." How curious, the slave questioning the mistress. These are indeed revolutionary times. I ignored the barb. Why, the breeding program, why continue it even as the Confederacy collapsed around you? As your world ended? Something flickered across her face, not remorse, but perhaps recognition, that she faced judgment not just from me, but from history itself. "Because property must be managed profitably," she answered without hesitation. "Because Blackwood blood produces superior stock. Because I understood what men like your Lieutenant Collins never will, that power flows to those willing to do what sentiment prohibits. And your sons, did they understand that lesson?" Her expression hardened. Thomas did. He recognized his duty to the family legacy. And Richard, she nearly spat the name, chose weakness, betrayal. He surrendered to the soft thinking of northern abolitionists instead of embracing his birthright. He chose humanity, I countered. Mrs. Blackwood laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. "Humanity is a luxury, Solomon, one your people cannot afford, and mine cannot indulge if we are to survive. This war may end slavery, but it will not end the natural order that placed me above you." I studied her, this woman who had orchestrated so much suffering with such cold rationality. In her rigid posture and unflinching gaze, I recognized the true horror that had defined Magnolia Plantation. Not supernatural evil, but the banal, calculating cruelty of human beings convinced of their own superiority. "The natural order is changing, Mrs. Blackwood," I said finally. "Your world is dying. Perhaps." Her chin lifted slightly. "But its ghost will haunt this country for generations. That at least gives me some satisfaction." With those prophetic words, she turned and re-entered the house, closing the door firmly behind her. I stood for a moment on the veranda, where I had once received orders as a house slave, now a Union sergeant overseeing liberation. The symmetry was powerful, but incomplete. Freedom proclaimed did not immediately translate to freedom realized, as the uncertain future facing the former slaves of Magnolia made clear. I returned to the wagons, where Lieutenant Collins was overseeing final preparations for departure. Martha had decided to remain after all, along with two elderly men too frail for the journey. They would negotiate terms with Mrs. Blackwood to work as paid laborers, a transition few had imagined possible even months earlier. As I helped the last young mother into a wagon, she suddenly gripped my hand. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're really free. She can't take my baby when he's weaned." "It's true," I assured her. "Your child is yours forever now. No one can sell him or separate you." Tears filled her eyes, the first I'd seen from any of the freed people, as though emotion had been too dangerous to express until this final moment of departure. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming back for us." The wagon train departed, as afternoon shadows lengthened across Magnolia's grounds. I rode alongside, assigned to escort them to the Union camp 20 miles north. As we passed through the gates that had once confined me, I glanced back at the plantation house gleaming white in the distance, its columns still projecting the illusion of antebellum permanence and prosperity. But illusion it was. The economic system that had built Magnolia was collapsing. The human property that had generated its wealth was departing. The ideology that had justified its horrors was being rejected, though not without a fight that would continue long after formal emancipation. Martha's parting words returned to me as we rode away from Magnolia for the last time. "Freedom is just the beginning, Solomon," she had said, her ancient eyes holding wisdom accumulated through a lifetime in bondage. "The hardest part comes next. Making freedom mean something." The wooden button from Richard's coat rested in my pocket, a small talisman of one white Southerner who had rejected his birthright of human ownership. I wondered where he was now, whether he had found purpose in the new world emerging from war's destruction. As for me, I rode forward as Sergeant Solomon Wright, no longer defined by Magnolia's boundaries or Mrs. Blackwood's ledger books. The horror story of the plantation's breeding program would be documented, remembered, part of the national reckoning that could not be avoided if America was to truly fulfill its founding promise of equality. The road ahead stretched long and difficult. The journey from legal freedom to true liberation, filled with obstacles Mrs. Blackwood had predicted with such cold certainty. But as we continued north toward Union lines, the formerly enslaved women and children carried something Magnolia had tried but failed to crush. Hope for a future they would shape themselves, dreams they would define without masters. Night fell as we traveled, stars emerging in the Mississippi sky just as they had during my escape a decade earlier. But this time we moved openly on main roads. No longer fugitives stealing freedom, but citizens claiming a birthright too long denied. The true horror of Magnolia Plantation, the calculated breeding program that treated human beings as livestock, was exposed to history's judgment, no longer hidden behind white columns and genteel southern manners. In my pocket, Richard's button pressed against my hand, reminder of the moral choice that had set my journey in motion. Ahead, the freed women spoke quietly among themselves, making plans, imagining possibilities that had been forbidden mere days ago. Their children slept in their arms, the first generation born in bondage, but who would grow up in freedom. The wagon wheels turned steadily northward, carrying us all toward an uncertain but self-determined future. Behind us, Magnolia Plantation receded into darkness, not forgotten, never forgotten, but powerless now to determine our fate. The horror story had ended. The harder, more complex story of freedom had just begun. As our caravan continued through the night, I recognized that true freedom would require more than proclamations or military victory. It would demand economic opportunity, political rights, social recognition, transformations that would meet fierce resistance from those who, like Mrs. Blackwood, believed in a natural order with themselves at its apex. Yet watching the quiet determination of the women we'd liberated from Magnolia's breeding program, I found reason for cautious hope. If they could endure such calculated cruelty and emerge with their humanity intact, perhaps the nation too could overcome its darkest chapter. The wooden button in my pocket reminded me that change required allies from all backgrounds, people willing to reject unjust systems, even when those systems benefited them personally. Richard Blackwood had made that choice a decade earlier. Others would need to make similar choices if America was to truly become a land of freedom for all. As dawn broke on the horizon, illuminating our path forward, I silently renewed the commitment I'd made upon escaping Magnolia 10 years earlier, to use my freedom not just for personal benefit, but in service to the larger struggle for justice. The plantation's horror story had ended, but the work of ensuring it could never happen again had only just begun.